At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Today on CityCast Madison. Here in our capital city, the State House is in its budget season. And for this state budget, the city of Madison wants to get what it sees as its fair share of state revenue. Madison recently hired a new conservative-led, high-profile lobbying firm, the Welch Group, to effectively represent Madison's interests in the Capitol. Will it work? Is it necessary? We asked someone who knows a thing or two about how the sausage is made in local and state government, former mayor of Madison, Dave Cheslevich. It's Wednesday, March 5th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Former Mayor Dave Cheslevich, welcome to CityCast Madison.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So some folks might know you as Mayor Dave. Others might know you through your column, Citizen Dave. You were the mayor of Madison from 2003 to 2011. So you've got a lot of perspective on local governance. So we want to mine your brain just a little bit here.
Okay. All right.
So this year, Madisonians will pay more in local property taxes than last. In November, residents voted yes to the $22 million referendum to address our city's budget deficit. Some critics argued then that instead of asking for more local taxes, the city could have done more to get state funds from the historic state surplus. And now the news is recently the city moved to hire a new lobbying firm to do just that, to better advocate for the city of Madison to get funding from the state. So the city has completely rejected the idea that they could have done more to lobby the state. What do you think?
Well, I voted for the referendum. Having put together 8 city budgets, I didn't see any way to balance that budget without the additional revenues. You could, but I think it would involve cuts that the average Madison resident wouldn't want. The big items, the truth is, in the city budget are police, fire, streets. And unless you're willing to live with fewer firefighters, fewer police officers, and less street maintenance, finding $22 million in cuts just isn't realistic. So I voted for it. As regards to more state revenues, I don't really think there's much the city of Madison could have done in this last budget to affect that, because what happened was the legislature and the governor couldn't come to agreement, and they left most of that money on the table. There's over $4 billion still sitting in state coffers, and it wasn't because the city of Madison didn't do enough. It was because the Republicans in the legislature and Governor Evers couldn't come to a grand agreement on that. So I didn't think it had much to do with the city.
Well, so with this new lobbying firm the city hired called the Welch Group, the city ended its membership with the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, a nonprofit membership group advocating on behalf of Wisconsin towns, villages, and cities. Do you think this move is a net good for the city?
Yeah, they hired the Welch Company. I know Bob Welch, who's the principal in that firm. He's an old-style Republican that when there used to be principal conservatives who weren't Trump style. And so Bob Welch comes out of that kind of conservative, sort of Tommy Thompson Republican background. He's that kind of guy.
I hear stories from people remembering like everyone after the session got out, they would all, Democrats and Republicans would all go out and grab a beer together, and that it was more, congenial.
I worked in the legislature back in the 90s, 80s and 90s. And that's the way it was. It wasn't this blood sport. Staff mixed it up. Legislators tended to get along personally, even if they disagreed. Welch comes from that kind of background. And so if you're going to hire a Republican firm, I think that's probably a good one to hire. And they're just dealing with the reality. Republicans control both houses. At least they will through this session, through the budget, which is crucial. And so I guess they wanted better contacts with Robin Vos and the rest of the Republicans.
And we started out this conversation talking about shared revenue, the share of money that municipalities get from the state. Madison wanted more. There's a disparity from what we got from what everyone else got in the state. According to the Wisconsin Policy Forum, as of 2024, the statewide average of funding per person is $142. But for the city of Madison, funding per person is only $29, so well below the average. Do you know, why is there such a stark difference? Are we just unliked?
Yes. Well, yeah. I wish.
Laugh not to cry.
Yeah, I wish there were another explanation, but we are. And the truth is, it's not just the Republicans. Back when I was mayor, the Democrats ran the show, and the Democratic legislators didn't particularly like us either. It is in part partisan, that's true. But I think it's not just that. It's a common resentment directed at capital cities. So the rest of the country beats up on Washington, D.C. I think you could go to any state in the union and find people outside of their capital city criticizing Lansing or Springfield or St. Paul or whatever. It's just a thing. The capital cities are viewed as a little bit elite. Obviously, people are sending their tax dollars to the capital city. A lot of those dollars stick around. Obviously, you can see that here in Madison. We have the university. We have a big state government footprint. And those are relatively stable, relatively well-compensated jobs with good benefits. And so, and people look around and they say, well, Madison's doing pretty good. And they're doing pretty good in part because of the tax money that gets sent here from other parts of the state. And that breeds a natural resentment. And I think legislators say, hey, they don't need more shared revenues. We're going to send it to some other community that needs it more. So obviously, as a former mayor, I think they're wrong about that. But that's the way they look at it.
Yeah, and us living here, I read that high property values also get negatively impacted in the state's algorithm.
They do. There's a couple things about that. So the way it was set up, and this was sort of true before Scott Walker, but then it became even more true when Walker became governor. Basically, the only way you can get more tax revenue out of property taxes is to grow its net increased value. So that's one of the reasons you see the Madison City Council and this mayor really promoting more and more development. In part, the city's got kind of a housing crisis and we need more housing, but in part, it's the only way they can grow the city budget is to build their way out of it. So I think it's created some incentives in that regard, which aren't entirely fair because that formula really doesn't have anything to do with the cost of running city government. It's got to do with this abstract of net new value, which is a very narrow part of the city's whole revenue structure, value structure. And so I think that needs to be changed, reformed in some way. And then Madison has a specific problem unique to it, which is all of that property, the whole university, campus, all of those big state office buildings, all that stuff is off the tax rolls. And the state does pay us something in what's called pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. And it's designed to compensate us a little bit for mostly police and fire protection. But it's not nearly what we would get if those buildings were developed and were on the tax rolls. And so Madison, sure, benefits from the university tremendously, benefits from state government, but also takes a hit because all that property is not generating much in the way of taxes.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
It really feels like the state's strictures and rules or deals that have been struck have Madison and cities across the state kind of in a bind in terms of what they can do to generate revenue. So, one of the things why we're talking today is because the city has hired a lobbying group. It's the same one that lobbies for the Green Bay Packers, just like a very, well-founded group. I want to shift our conversation to talk more about lobbying power in Madison and just pulling the curtain back a little bit about what lobbying looks like in the state capitol. First off, I think some people hear the term lobbyists and lobbying and they think it's kind of a dirty word. But when it comes to city operations, is it simply a necessary tool?
Yeah, lobbying is, in some ways, I guess it's a necessary evil. It's just the reality of dealing with the legislature and to some extent the governor. And, just the way of the world is that most lobbyists come out of the legislature. Either they were legislators themselves, as Bob Welch was, or they were legislative aides, like I was at one time. And so out of that world, they have their contacts. A couple things. One is they know the process, but then they also have personal relationships with legislators and legislative staff. And over time, they've developed, for lack of a better word, trust with them. And so they have access. They can go in and see Robin Voss. They can go in and see the Joint Finance Committee co-chairs. They have access simply because of their personal relationships. And getting in the door is half the battle. So that's why the city hired a guy like Welch. He has those kinds of ins. And so he can at least sit down with Robin Voss. Now, Robin Voss may say, I hate the city of Madison and I won't do a thing for him, but at least he can get in front of Robin Voss and make the city's case. I think that's the nature of the beast. And the city just realizes that that's how it works. And so that's how we ended up where we are.
So there are folks who are lobbyists and then people who are in the city government, like the mayor, who can also go and lobby, and it's basically where you're trying to get something done, right? I'm curious, from your perspective, what role can the mayor or anyone in the city government, for that matter, play when it comes to interfacing and working with people in state government?
Well, let me tell you a story about that. When I was mayor, again, the Democrats controlled things for most of the time. And I knew these people from having worked in the legislature and just having been around politics for so long. And so I had the ability to go in and see them directly. We did have a person on staff who lobbied, but for the most part, if I really needed to go see Mark Miller, who was the Senate Majority Leader for a time, I could just go see him. But then the Republicans took over right at the end of my term. They won in 2010, and I was gone by 2011. But there was a brief period where I was still around, and Robin Voss became, he may have been Joint Finance co-chair, I'm not sure. In any event, I went to go see him while I was still mayor, and we were fighting the issue of, you may remember, the high-speed rail proposal between Madison and Milwaukee.
R.I.P.
Right. And Scott Walker came into office vowing to kill it. And part of that whole thing was something called the Regional Transit Authority. We had fought for an RTA for a long time. We had taxing authority. It was going to generate money to run the bus system and also help us build the infrastructure for high-speed rail and all that. And I knew Robin Voss hated regional transit authorities for whatever reason. So I went to go see him, talked to him directly in the assembly parlor, gave him all my pitches, and every one he just knocked down. It didn't matter what I said. He didn't want the RTA to be able to directly impose a sales tax. He wanted there to be a referendum first. I said, fine, happy to have a referendum. Well, then he didn't like the makeup of the Regional Transit Authority. I had to have different makeup. Fine by me. I agreed to that. He kept bringing up these things. Every one of them I just agreed to. And in the end, he said, oh, no, I think we got to start from scratch. And they ended up repealing the whole thing. Tell the story because I think that's what the city is still up against. Robin Voss just didn't like RTAs, didn't like the city of Madison. It wasn't anything I could say. I could agree to all of his conditions, and he still wasn't going to do what the city wanted. And I just think that kind of attitude is still there. And, God love him. I hope Bob Welch can jostle that a little bit, but I think he's up against a lot.
Yeah. The Welch Group is a conservative lobbying firm. So some folks might be thinking, is that at odds with what they think of, quote, liberal Madison? When it comes to mind, does this firm make sense to you?
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're not going to. So, they're a lobbying firm. They're going to work on behalf of their clients. And so they'll have conversations with the city of Madison. The mayor and others will tell Welch what the city would like. Welch, if he's doing his job, will tell them what he thinks is possible. And then Welch will carry the arguments of his client to the folks he knows in the legislature. So I don't think it matters a heck of a lot what Welch's personal politics might be. He's being paid to do a job. And I don't see any problem with that. I'd see more of a problem if the city decided they were going to go with some Democratic firm that just didn't have the same contacts that Welch has. As I said earlier, part of it is just getting in the door. And Welch can at least get in the door to make the case.
Yeah. Do you feel like at this point, does it take another Republican or conservative voice to get anything done in the state capitol these days?
I just think the start is being able to have a conversation. They can do that. The one thing that gives me just a little bit of hope is the margins have been narrowed. So it used to be Republicans just didn't have to care at all about losing the majority. They could do whatever they wanted. Through gerrymandering, their majorities were so big that they couldn't really see messing it up so bad that they'd actually lose the majority. Now, I don't know I think it's like 5 seats in the assembly, something like that, maybe 3 in the Senate. That's striking distance. And so they have to worry. They're moderates, and they have a few moderates in that caucus. They have to worry that they could get knocked off in a general election. And so there may be enough moderate Republican votes from swing districts where deals are possible that wouldn't have been possible in the last session.
Best case scenario, what do you hope the Welch Group accomplishes for Madison? Like, what things could be possibly realistic to be gained at this point in time?
I think they got to find a way to make common cause with other municipalities, hopefully other municipalities in Republican districts. So, for example, the RTA, the Regional Transit Authority, the reason we initially got that through, even though Voss killed it later, was that Appleton, in a Republican part of the state, Fox River Valley, wanted an RTA. They wanted an RTA previous to our wanting an RTA. And so by authorizing it, it wasn't just helping Madison, it was also helping a part of the state that Republicans represented. I think the best thing that the city and the Welch Group can do is to try to find common cause like that. So maybe a change, for example, in the payments for municipal services. A lot of communities in our state have state property in them, and they're in the same boat Madison is. We have more state property, so it's a bigger issue to us. But a whole lot of communities are getting these payments in lieu of taxes, which are lower than what they would get if the property was on their private tax rolls. So if they could do something to increase payments in lieu of taxes, that's not just going to help Madison. It's going to help a whole bunch of communities around the state, many of them in Republican districts. That's an example of something you can do. Changes in the share revenue formula. Madison, as you pointed out, really gets hammered in that, but there's only one community in the whole state that gets less per capita than Madison. It's a township in Waukesha Lake Country, which is like the most Republican part of the whole state. And it's actually getting hit worse than we are. So you could mess around with the share revenue formula in a way that would help Madison, but would also help a bunch of Republican communities at the same time. Point is, I think that's the thing to look for. You don't want to ever go into the legislature, particularly this one, and say, we're here, we want to do something to help Madison. That's a non-starter. But I think he can say things like, yeah, the share revenue formula is unfair to a lot of communities, and here's a list, and we want to help them. I think that's got a chance.
Yeah, it sounds like coalition building across the state.
Yep.
And I was thinking about Milwaukee and some of the lobbying efforts they did. It looks like they had some positive experiences bringing business leaders and in terms of helping the cause and building more relationship coalition building. So it sounds like that's the answer.
Yeah, well, very effective. Although Milwaukee is a different scenario. They do have very effective leadership. Mayor Cavalier Johnson is a very sharp guy, and so is the county executive. That's helpful, and we have good leadership too in Madison. I don't mean to cast any aspersions there, but good leadership. And then the thing about Milwaukee is it has a very strong business community, which is very tied in with Republicans at the state level. The Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is the most powerful state lobbying organization for business, is really a Milwaukee-based organization. And so they have those strong ties to the Republican Party and Robin Vos, generate a lot of campaign contributions. And so Milwaukee has, in a way, more clout in the legislature because of those connections to the business community in Milwaukee. Madison doesn't really have those kinds of connections. Our business community tends to be more progressive, doesn't have the same kind of Republican contacts that the Milwaukee business community does. And so I think it is a bit apples and oranges.
Mm. The whole topic of lobbying, it seems a little like it's behind the scenes. It's, people think of it as a negative thing, as we talked about. I know that not everyone is as jazzed as at the idea of a city lobbyist. Actually, a candidate who was in the running for city council this election, but ultimately lost in the primary, sent in a public comment against the city's decision to hire a lobbyist, saying in part, quote, "Elected officials and city staff are responsible for representing the interests of Madison residents, and outsourcing these duties to a lobbyist undermines both transparency and accountability. By hiring an external firm without a competitive bidding process, the city is sidestepping fiscal responsibility and potentially opening the door to conflicts of interest." End of quote. What do you think? What's your response to that?
We hired a lobbyist when I was mayor. We did have a competitive bidding process, so I don't know what's up with that. But we did it way back in whatever it was, 2009, 2010, something like that. And we did it for the same reasons. Lobbying isn't just going to make your case. A lot of lobbying is simply about being there. I mean, it's literally about being in the lobby, spending your whole day in the Capitol, walking around, touching base with people in different offices, stopping in at committee hearings. You get to know people and you hear stuff. And you can't do that without being there pretty much all the time, every day.
What bills are happening? Like what's happening on the ground? Yeah.
And it's really, we tried to do that in my office. We had a guy in-house who did it, worked in my office. Great guy, Mario Mendoza, is a lawyer and did a great job for us, but he had other responsibilities and he couldn't spend his whole day hanging around the Capitol. He had things to do within city government. And to be honest with you, again, getting back to this point, I guess I keep harping on, being identified as the city of Madison lobbyist is not necessarily a positive thing in the Wisconsin legislature. And the thing about a guy like Welch is he's not identified as the city of Madison lobbyist. He's identified as Bob Welch, this guy we know, and he represents a bunch of clients, and we like some of them, we don't like others. So it's a different thing. And as for just the whole practice of lobbying, I was a lobbyist. I lobbied for the Nature Conservancy. I think a lot of people would say the Nature Conservancy is a pretty good organization, does a lot of good. And we had a lobbyist and I was it. I don't think lobbying is, by definition, a corrupt or awful business. It can be. Some lobbyists certainly have crossed the line in the past. But as a profession, it doesn't have to be. And 90% of the cases, it isn't.
Did that term come from going and hanging out in somebody's lobby?
Yeah. Yes. And
it literally just occurred to me. I've worked in D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And you're in the lobby. You know what's going on. You're making your voice heard.
And it's actually a very descriptive term because good lobbyists are hanging around the lobby and prowling the hallways and just being around. Yep.
Yeah. Well, before we let you go, we do want to ask, is there anything else that we should be keeping in mind when it comes to this topic on Madison's money needs and lobbying efforts and what we've been discussing?
It was smart for the city to hire a lobbyist. I do think it was smart for the city to hire one with Republican connections. Democrats are going to try to help Madison as best they can anyway. You need help on the Republican side. And so I think it was smart. We'll see if it yields any benefits. This is the time to do it because it's budget time. But I think the city is trying to put themselves in the best possible position to get as much state resources as they can. Made sense.
Well, Dave Cheslevich, we appreciate you making the time. Thank you so much for sharing your brain with us.
What's left to share? You bet.
That's former mayor of Madison, Dave Cheslevich. He also writes the Isthmus opinion column, Citizen Dave. That's all for today. Here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, your host. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who loves city services? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care.